brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. After greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified God, and they said to him, "You see, brethren, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law, and they have been told about you, that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourselves along with them and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with their judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality." Then Paul took the men, and the next day he purified himself along with them and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled and the offering presented for each one of them.
All right, thank you very much. So yeah, in verse 16, we saw them staying with a disciple named Manason, and learned a little bit that he was from Cyprus, one of the earliest disciples. And so, following that, when they arrived at Jerusalem, they say in verse 17, "When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present." So, last week we talked a lot about, well, we saw a lot of interactions that were very heartfelt and very tough times just relationally, just because there was all these leavings. We saw that in the case of Paul and the Ephesian elders, and then we saw that with the disciples that he had just met as well, and having spent some time with them. So there was a big emphasis on just the relationships of brothers and sisters in the faith, and we talked about that a little bit last week and how important it was, and how that's reflected in Scripture here, and how it can be reflected in our lives. And then we see once again in verse 17 that the brothers received us warmly. So this is kind of a reunion of sorts after Paul being away for years. And finally coming back, I'm sure some of these believers were ones that he knew and others that he didn't. And so this was a happy reunion as he is back in town, as it were. And then the next day, verse 18, Paul and the rest of us went down to see James, and all the elders were present. So if you remember at the Jerusalem Council, James was over a lot of the discussion and debate, and that's one of the... Bill, you need a blank? You didn't hear me, but... I got this for you, especially. Thanks. You're welcome. But that was one of the... James being over a lot of the proceedings of the Jerusalem Council, the Council of Jerusalem. Going back several chapters, one of the things that did was help us to sort of contradict the Roman Catholic understanding of Peter as the Pope, as James was seen to exhibit a lot of authority there, and was kind of the spokesperson. And so it seemed like Peter wasn't really in that position. And then here we see after the conclusion of the Jerusalem Council that it seems like a lot of the other apostles had kind of gone on their own way and gone out to do some evangelizing on their own terms. And then James was left in charge of the church at Jerusalem, because it mentions him specifically, and then as all these elders were around them. But it's more about James just being one of the apostles, and that's kind of where his authority was established in. And so I don't know if there's anything incredibly supernatural going on with that, but it's just that's who James is, and that's why he's the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And then all the elders were present as well. So that just helps us give some better insight into the history there, and kind of helps us refute some of those Catholic claims. That's the first fill in the blank. Seems like a cheap one, but there it is. James seemed to have had authority over the church in Jerusalem. James seemed to have had authority over the church in Jerusalem. And then in verse 19, Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done through the Gentiles, among the Gentiles through his ministry. So, very characteristic of Paul, he attributes all of his ministerial success and all the many conversions to God's working, and not trying to bring any any notoriety to his own name, but attributes all of it to God, and it gives him the glory. Verse 20, when they heard this, they praised God, to James and the elders. When they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, you see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or to live according to our customs. So in verse 20, we see the start of this. They praised God along with Paul and the brothers, seeing that all that God had done and the ministry with the Gentiles. So this kind of shows us that James and the elders, they're on the same side as Paul and the disciples. So this dispute that's brought up by James is not one that he and the elders are a part of. In other words, he's not saying that we think this as well and we've heard all these reports and are believing it also. But that little phrase there that said they praised God along with them kind of shows us that they're on the same page there. But nevertheless, there is somewhat of an issue. How many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law? So this is very characteristic of Jews becoming Christians, that they still have a high regard for the law. And sometimes we see that Jews go way too far in that direction, and they're the Judaizers who say that even the Gentiles who come to believe in Jesus, that they must also hold to the teachings of the law and along with the teachings of the apostles in Jesus' own commands. But that was a very normal thing for these Jews who came to believe in Jesus to have high regard for the law and to still be willing to obey it. They have been informed, verse 21, they've been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. So here, they have been informed. That word informed in Greek essentially translates to rumors that have been spread about Paul. And so someone or a group of people or a spread out group of people have been spreading this message, spreading these rumors that are intentionally false about Paul and that his ministry. That it's not like something outright ludicrous, but it takes what he's been doing and what we've seen him to be doing in Acts so far, and it twists it in a way. Because we know that Paul has been teaching a lot about the liberty and the faith, and how we know from a lot of his epistles as well. I mean, we read Romans, it talks a lot about this, how the law is not what saves us. The law ultimately points to Jesus who does save us, but the law itself is not the very thing that brings salvation. And so, obviously, when he's talking to Gentiles, he says that you are not under the law. This was a big theme in Galatians, because the Judaizers had come in and tried to put those prescriptions on them. But for Paul, the Gentiles, I mean, that was a non-issue. He was saying, no, this is not for you. You are not under the law, but under grace. And so their argument is that he has been teaching all these Jews to do the exact same thing, to just completely throw off the law, disregard it entirely, and don't even worry about it. To totally disband not obey the Mosaic law. But that's not what he has been teaching, of course. We know that he himself observed many Jewish rituals, and he observed the days and things like that, and so and some of the commands. And so we know that that is not what he has been teaching, nor what he has been practicing himself. But there was this rumor that had been spread, and so they have a problem here. In verse 22, so what shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come, so do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses, so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everybody will know there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. So from some of the context clues, what kind of vow do you guys think these 4 men have taken?
Sounds like a Nazarite vow.
That's it. Do you know the 3 prohibitions for people to watch out for when they're under the Nazarite vow?
No strong drink and no cutting your hair. Those are the only 2 I can remember.
No strong drink. Yep, those are 2 of the 3. Does anybody know the last one? It's just a bonus question.
I'm sure one is.
That's what she mentioned. That one, yes.
I didn't hear.
Yeah.
Celibacy, I don't know.
She mentioned it's a number 6. She mentioned no cutting your hair, and then no drinking.
Celibacy.
Nope.
Something to do with what you wear.
Nope.
Can you give us a hint?
Nope. No, it's okay. I mean, this isn't a huge question. It was more of just.
Isn't it, don't touch anything that's dead?
Yep, that's it.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, one of our Johnson professors gave this alliteration that says, no bick, no booze, no body. So no bick, no razor, no booze, no drinking of any alcohol or anything like that, no bodies, no touching dead bodies. So
Just think of Samson, he broke all of them, so.
right, yeah, he was, yeah.
So what about the people like that, what about people that followed the Nazarite laws when one of them died?
When one of the Nazarites died?
Yeah, like, the other Nazarites couldn't take care of it, so, I mean, what they
Yeah.
do, like, they phone a friend, I mean,
Didn't they usually have a time limit though?
What's that?
Didn't they usually have a, like, for a time frame? It wasn't just like forever and ever.
Right, yeah, there were
Oh.
various
Okay.
periods, right? So some of them could take the Nazarite vow for their entire lifetime. That was an option. But in this time period, what was common was 30 days. That was the predominant period of time that someone would take up the Nazarite vow. But also, talking about the dead body thing, that's also mentioned in number 6. And there's some descriptions there that help the person. It says, like, if someone's with you and they die, what to do, essentially. So it's kind of interesting that it takes that into account. But anyway, so this is... Don, you brought that up. So this is the 30 days. This is what's going on here, that these men have taken this 30 days. And all the Nazarite vow is Nazarite essentially means to set yourself apart. And so it's a setting yourself apart for God, maybe because of something that He's done for you, and you want to just express your gratitude in some way by kind of denying some of these worldly things and dedicating yourself to His work and His ministry. But or you could just do that because you have a desire to. And men and women can all, either male or female, could do this. And so that's what it was all about. And so we find these 4 men. Well, we have somewhat of an issue, and we know that Paul doesn't want to be here for 30 days. He wants to move on. He doesn't want to stay there for that long. So he didn't want to have to go through the whole 30-day vow. So what you can actually do is he can join in kind of midway with these men who are already in the midst of their Nazarite vow and complete it with them. And so that's what we see here exactly. And it's just a way to kind of, well, deny some of these allegations against Paul that he doesn't care about Jewish laws whatsoever. Well, he's participating in the Nazarite vow, so it seems like he does care about the Jewish laws still. So it just puts some truth to what these people are saying about him. And there's one guy who said he had some helpful stuff to say about it as well. I think it was Reese. Yeah, okay, so he just kind of elaborates a little bit more. So he says, a man might associate himself with a Nazarite or a company of them, go through the purification process, offer sacrifices with them, and pay for their sacrifices. So he could do all of this. This was considered a devout act, actually, and it says Agrippa the first, for instance, had in this way gained acceptance with the Jews as showing his reverence for the law. So Reese kind of points out there that this is something that Paul could do even if he didn't want to go through the whole 30 days of the vow. And where do we leave off here? So that's the, okay, that's actually number 2 and number 3 on the fill in the blanks. Number 2 was, we said a few minutes ago, there were people who were intentionally spreading rumors about Paul preaching total abandonment of the Mosaic law. There were people who were intentionally spreading rumors about Paul preaching total abandonment of the Mosaic law. Are those blanks big enough? I tried to make them bigger this week.
They are much better.
Gracie.
If he had something, he'd throw it at you.
Well, they help me write a little bit bigger so that I can write a little neater. So you can
Yeah.
read my writing. At first I was making it so sloppy, I don't think it was awful.
Well, maybe that's why they were so small, because to me it doesn't really matter. Big or small, it's going to be sloppy either way, so it doesn't really matter. But yeah, no, I tried to make them a hair bigger per request. All right, so
So were they done with the vow? Because it said that they were going to shave their heads.
yeah, they were almost finished with it. So he joins them. I think it's 7 days prior to that, and that's when he's kind of taking his this purification as well. So he's going to do that for 7 days, and it's going to happen to coincide with the conclusion of the Nazarite vow that these men are in. And so he joins in with them for that. So take these men, verse 24. Take these men. Join in their purification rites and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everybody will know there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. As for the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. Do you guys remember how that was talked about? Those were the commands that were given to the Gentile churches after the Jerusalem Council. That's what they agreed on. And so James and the elders are saying what we had decided for the Gentiles to do is still good. Like that's going to be the same. It holds constant. So we're not going to teach them to do anything else or put extra commands, extra yokes on their backs. And then verse 26, the next day Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end and the offering would be made for each of them. So he goes on their behalf because they're still in the midst of the Nazarite vow, so they're not actually able to go into the temple at that time. But he could, because he hadn't participated in it just yet, and so he was going to give notice of the date within the days of purification, and then that could provide their offerings for them. So that's what they decided to do, and that's number 3 on the fill in the blanks. The object lesson they devised, James and the elders, the object lesson they devised contradicted the false claims about Paul's preaching. The object lesson they devised contradicted the false claims about Paul's preaching. All right. so far so good, until this verse. Verse 27, when the 7 days, oh man, we haven't read this yet. Somebody want to read verse 27 through, verses 27 through 39? Ann? Thank you.
When the 7 days were almost over, the Jews from Asia, upon seeing him in the temple, began to stir up all the crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, come to our aid. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law and this place. And besides, he has even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with him, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then all the city was provoked, and the people rushed together, and taking hold of Paul, they dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. While they were seeking to kill him, a report came up to the commander of the Roman cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. At once he took along some soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander came up and took hold of him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. And he began asking who he was and what he had done. But among the crowd, some were shouting one thing and some another. And when he could not find out the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. When he got to the stairs, he was carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. For the multitude of the people kept following them, shouting, "Away with him!" As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek? Then you are not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out of the wilderness?" But Paul said, I am a Jew of Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no insignificant city, and I beg you to allow me to speak to the people.
Thank you. Yes, we're stopping there because I don't want to get into his speech to the crowd just yet. I don't think we're going to have time. All right, there's a problem here. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him. Anybody remember what happened in Asia a few chapters ago?
The riot in Ephesus.
Yep, that's it. That's it. So,
That was over Artemis, wasn't it?
right. So we're going to see some similarities between that story and this one, just from the position of the chaos of the crowd. But then there's also some parallels with a different story, some of which we talked about last week, other parallels. So some Jews from the province of Asia who were not happy at Paul, and they saw him at the temple, and then they stirred up the whole crowd and seized him. So they would have recognized him just because, he was in Asia, not only just in Ephesus, but he was in Asia for about 3 years ministering, and so he was in the Jewish synagogues, as we know, so a lot of these Jews would have recognized him, would have known who he was just by seeing his face. And so they did this, and in verse 28, they're shouting, "Men of Israel, help us. This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against our people and our law in this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple area and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple area. So, this accusation is even a little bit more ludicrous than what James had said the accusation was, because they're saying here that this man who teaches all men everywhere, so everyone, Gentiles, Jews, against our people and our law in this place. So in this place being the temple, and we obviously know that is an outright lie, just because that is not what he's been teaching the Gentiles nor the Jews. So this is a twisting of his ministry. Yeah, okay. And then Luke gives us some of the reasoning that they're talking about, or one of their accusations in verse 28. So, besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple area and defiled this holy place, which was strictly forbidden to do. They were not allowed to bring any Gentiles into the temple area. And so they had seen him. Luke makes this note after the fact, that they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with Paul, and they just assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple area. So that would have been pretty good grounds for punishment of Paul. And though they had not actually, Luke doesn't say that they had hardcore evidence of this, they just assumed that this was something that he had done. And so, anyways, those were two of their arguments, and neither of them were true. And then verse 30, the whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions, seizing Paul. They dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. So does this sound at all like the riot in Ephesus? Right? A lot of the same characteristics of the actions of the mob, just kind of chaos, and someone getting everybody together and using all their emotions, heightened emotions against a person. So immediately all the gates were shut. They dragged him out of the temple, and immediately all the gates were shut. So that's possibly because they didn't want to allow any more Greeks or Gentiles to enter into the temple area, although that hadn't happened. That's why they would have shut the gates. But while they were trying to kill him, verse 31, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. So Luke doesn't pull any punches here. He makes it very clear that their intention was not just to punish Paul in some way or give him a trial or something like that. I mean, they were beating him with the intention of killing him. And the only reason that this stopped is because in verse 32, he at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. So that was really the only reason that Paul lived in this situation. So when they pulled Paul out of the temple, this would have made them visible. Oh, no, not this one. This would have made the whole crowd and all that was going on visible to the Romans. We've got to better organize these things. What was this? Okay, all right. So Gardner here gives us some good insight. The frenzied crowd pounded Paul to the point it was clear they wanted him dead. News of the commotion soon came to the attention of the commander of the Roman troops. Kiliarchos, or tribune, served, that's what it is in Greek, served as commander over 1,000 troops, 760 of whom were infantry and a cavalry of 240. They were garrisoned at the fortress of Antonia on the northwestern corner of the temple complex, right? So it's geographically pretty close to where all this is going down. A vantage point from which the Romans kept a close eye on any disturbances in the Jewish temple. So when all of this was brought outside, they could actually see all this going on, and that's when they were able to intervene, because they could see that there was trouble brewing. Since the fortress had several high towers, perhaps 100 feet high, and was connected to the temple area by only 2 flights of steps, Roman soldiers could be at the site of trouble quickly. So they made sure to do this because they didn't want anything going down that was out of their control. And good thing they did, because Paul was about to be killed. And so, Dan, your translation there said centurions, didn't it?
It did.
Which is good. Mine doesn't for some reason. The NIV. Well, I'm just using the church or a Bible from the sanctuary. Centurions, which is good. That's who it is. He at once took some officers and soldiers, or centurions, for the officers, and ran down to the crowd. So centurions, I mean, these were leaders of 100 men, and so the fact that he took multiple, it's plural here. So there's at least 200 soldiers coming down to this riot, which is a pretty sizable force and pretty intimidating coming down. And they knew, at that moment, the Jews knew that they couldn't continue this any longer. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. There wasn't really anything else for them to do. And then in verse, what's that?
Seems to me the Jews loved beating people.
Yeah, they did. They did. And there were some stringent laws on doing that, but it doesn't really seem, they don't really seem to care too much about that at this time. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. So he came up and he arrested him, and that was the quickest, most efficient way to calm the situation down and to get him out of there. And then it says that he bound him with 2 chains, and what that means is that Paul would have just been bound between 2 Roman soldiers. He would have just been chained to either of them and under guard. And so then he asked who he was and what he had done. And so then some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another. And since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. Now, does that sound familiar to anything else that we've read in the New Testament? In the Gospels, like Luke 23.
I was taking Jesus off, wasn't
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so there's these accusations coming against Paul, similarly to how there were the accusations coming against Jesus, and all of it was untrue, and or some distortion of the truth in some way. And it's clear that nobody really has a good argument, but they're at this moment in time, in this case with Paul, are just in that mob mentality, heightened by emotion in what this guy did, because they're hearing about all these things about how he hates the law, he hates the temple, and he's directing and is teaching everybody to do the same and to neglect it entirely, which is not the case. But obviously for the Jews, I mean, this wasn't just some game that they played, like the Jewish religion. It wasn't just some fun thing that they did. I mean, this was their whole lives, especially for the leaders of the Jewish religious leaders. So they obviously took great offense at this and considered it sacrilege and against Yahweh, and even though they're wrong. So that was the reason for them acting with such passion as they did, and with such intensity to kill Paul, because they thought that he was profaning God and His name and all that God had commanded in the Old Testament, which isn't true again. Yeah, so they shouted some shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great, so reached the steps to go back up to the fortress. The violence of the mob was so great that he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Away with him! Away with him!" In Luke 23, we see just that happening. And I guess I'll just start in Luke 23, verse 13. Pilate called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who is inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him, neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore I will punish him and then release him." With one voice they cried out, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us." So that's in Luke. So Luke is very much trying to connect these two stories. Obviously, Paul is not a perfect man, nor would he consider himself the Messiah in any way. But the emphasis is still there, and it's very intentional, showing us how these Jews were consistently rebelling against God in His ways, even though they maybe have thought that they were trying to be faithful to God in His ways. That wasn't the case. And how Paul was reflecting the attitude and the actions of Christ in his dedication to carrying out the mission before him. And so just as Jesus was submissive to God and his will, and that God's will was that he should die on the cross for the sins of the world, so the mission of Paul to go and preach the gospel in Jerusalem, and this was, and to celebrate Pentecost, of course, but this was, the Holy Spirit told him that he was going to be in danger, and that's exactly what happened, but it did not deter him from what he set out to do. So just the faithfulness of the two were both reflected in these stories. Away with them. So the chaos, number 4 on the fill in the blanks there, that's what this is. The chaos of the attack on Paul. Chaos of the attack on Paul is reminiscent of the mob in Ephesus, and also Luke's account of Jesus' trial. Chaos of the attack on Paul is reminiscent of the mob in Ephesus, and also Luke's account of Jesus' trial. And you can just see from this story how they hated Paul. I mean, they absolutely hated him. And they wanted him to die. And this is incredible hatred, which next week it's going to be so astounding, Paul's response to everything that had happened to him just moments ago. It's going to be absolutely mind-blowing. But they absolutely despise, abhor Paul. And then verse 37, as the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" One of the commenters said that he speaks this to him in Greek, and it's a very polite thing to ask. He's not he's not being mean in any way, but it's a pretty formal thing. And then the commander's kind of surprised. "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you?" And then his first question on his mind, this is what he wants to know. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out to the desert some time ago?" Paul answered, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." So, once again, he was surprised because Aramaic was the language of the Palestinian Jews. That's what they would have spoken, and probably a lot of them wouldn't have really known Greek that well. And he's shocked that Paul does, and so he asks him right away if he is this one who is this Egyptian man who has led a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the desert some time ago. So he's talking about an event that had happened 3 years prior, where an Egyptian person had, well, I'll just read it here. Gardner gives us some good info. So his reference was to an incident also reported by Josephus. 3 years earlier, an Egyptian had arrived in Jerusalem, promising the Jews that the walls of Jerusalem would tumble down if they joined him on the Mount of Olives. He then claimed that God would lead the Jews to victory over the Romans. Josephus says that 30,000 people followed him. Felix, the procurator, put an end to the adventure, however, by sending troops who killed 400 of the rebels, took another 200 prisoners, and the rest fled. The Egyptian managed to disappear. Perhaps the commander suspected that Paul was the Egyptian who returned to the temple and was recognized by Jews. He was, if that was the case, he was eager to get even with them. So that was the story, and that's who the commander wanted to know if that was him. But it wasn't him, because Paul answers, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." And there he's not referring to his Roman citizenship, as he will, I think, just a little bit later on, but essentially just kind of denying the question. He says, "No, that's not me. I'm a member. My hometown is from Tarsus, and that's where my citizenship lies." Okay, so, and then we will leave him wanting to speak to the crowd. So, number 5, the fill in the blanks there. This verses a few verses ago, but the hatred the crowd expressed towards Paul was only broken up by the group of at least 200 soldiers intervening. The hatred the crowd expressed towards Paul was only broken up by the group of at least 200 soldiers intervening. All right, so a miracle has just happened. It's 4 minutes till 7:30.
I was even in here.
What do we do?
Yeah, I know. I guess we'll just, you guys like silence, we'll just sit here, just kind of stare at each other. No, I mean, do you have any thoughts about the passage that we just read, or questions, or anything that you want to discuss? Since we normally don't have time for that. And, yeah.
So, do you think that the commander suspected that he was the Egyptian and that's why he snatched him up to find that out?
Potentially, yeah. I think that their immediate concern was just getting him out of the crowd and trying to dispel that mob that had just formed, because that was trouble, and they didn't want it to go any further. But potentially.
That's back when cities controlled malls.
What's that?
So that's back when cities controlled malls.
Mm.
Don't tend to do that.
They're afraid to hurt people's feelings.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Anybody else?
The reference to the period of 7 days
Yeah.
in the middle of the text there was,
Yeah.
without a little backstory on that, that's a pretty obscure statement. That
Yeah.
If you don't know, that doesn't really,
Right.
it looked kind of like a red herring when you read through that.
Well, it was just a purification ritual that could have been performed every 3 or 7 days, and so that was the ritual was just happened to, like I said, it just happened to coincide with the completion of the Nazirite vow that they were performing, that Paul had kind of joined in on, and so they were. That's really all that's going on there. Is just they were purifying themselves.
So he joined the marathoners in the last mile.
Right, yeah, to get the participation trophy.
In that sense, if you're talking running, that's the best way to do it. Not necessarily
Yeah. Yeah, that is a good way to put it. Any others? Anybody else? Today there wasn't a whole lot of practical teaching, like, oh man, I can go away learning this thing and how to apply it to my life. But it's setting us up for next week, really, because we're gonna read what Paul says to the people, and it's quite amazing. But it just
Paul was, he's being beaten and he still wants to talk to the people. That's something you can take away. He was
yeah,
instantly forgiving of those people.
yeah,
He still wanted to talk with them and be like, spread good news and be, do what he was called to do, even though they had just mauled him and beat him.
Yeah.
That's something we can take away.
I know. I mean, we don't really know what kind of physical condition he was in, but we can assume it was not good.
Yeah, they were carrying
We know
him,
it's
so
very
probably
his
not.
mom.
Right, yeah, yeah. So he
And
was
older.
pretty battered.
And considering his background, you wonder why they weren't like, well, what's really turned him around? I
Yeah.
mean, he did a 180 here about,
Mm-hmm.
the Christians.
Yeah. Yeah, it
I
is.
kind of wonder if that's why they had him on the roll, because he was such a Pharisee.
Yeah, maybe so. That he was one of them, and then he turned to what they would call the dark side. But it is a tremendous story. But it just shows. Well, I mean, the rumor thing that just happens for people who hate truth. They'll be blasphemed by people. I mean, that was stated of Jesus, and so we know that it's, especially in this time period where persecution was more prevalent and more intense than we find in our country, obviously, but still can be just as intense in other countries today for Christians. We know that the world doesn't like the truth of the gospel, because the gospel condemns the world and talks about punishment.
The world doesn't like the truth, period.
No.
That's a sad fact.
But for Paul, he was ready for it, and he said that this is probably what's going to happen to me, and still I go. And it is. That's, at the very least, that's something that we can seek to exemplify in our own lives and grow in maturity in. All right, thank you guys. Appreciate our discussion. Well, sorry I didn't ask too many questions tonight, but like I said, this was kind of a setup for next week. So we'll get together next week. Mike, you want to close us in prayer, if you would?
Sure. Father God, thank you for this lesson today, and just as an encouragement to us, Lord, that we can expect trouble and prepare our hearts for that, and stand firm in the truth, Lord. Thank you for this message. Just bless us throughout our week today. Amen.
Amen.